Good evening. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Peace and Conflict Studies program. It's my pleasure and indeed honor to introduce Professor Enzo Traverso to you. Enzo he tells us in his recent book, from the small town of Garvi in Piedmont. And he describes it very charmingly as wedged between a river and a castle and surrounded by hills, like other settlements on the borders of Piedmont and Liguria. Known for its fine wines, its typical pastries, and its ravioli, it has led a fairly prosperous and fairly peaceful life. But then he tells us in his book about how into this place came the struggle against the Nazis, the battles between Nazis and partisans, bombing by the US Air Force, and the whole unfolding of the catastrophe of the time. As he says in the book, this book in part is inspired by that historical experience and his own family's political history, his experiences as a young political activist in Italy in the 1970s. So I think, like the work of many great scholars, it is rooted in a certain autobiography. Enzo studied in Genoa and in Paris, and he's the author of a formidable list of major works on modern European history, The Origins of Nazi Violence, which has been translated into, I think it's 7 languages, and The End of Jewish Modernity, The Jews in Germany, and many others. And having taught in France for many years, he's now Susan and Barton Winocur Professor in the Humanities at Cornell University. I just want to say something about this wonderful book which he has just published, Fire and Blood. This book, subtitled The European Civil War, 1914 to 1945. And I have to say that it's very seldom that one reads a book which really changes the way you think about issues which you've been mulling over for decades of your life. But to me, this was exactly such a book. It's a book of incredible erudition, great humanity, and a book which considers war through the lens of the thinkers, the great thinkers of war of the 20th century. So, it's a sort of, ritual to express great pleasure in being able to welcome somebody to your university. But for me, it really is a deeply felt pleasure to welcome you here, Enzo Traverso.
Many thanks to Professor Hislop for his generous introduction and for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here at Colgate University and to be able to present my works on war and violence and to discuss with you about that. Interpreting the age of global violence could easily turn into a gallery of horrors or an awful, monotonous succession of wars and genocides from the Great War to Iraq and Syria, passing through Auschwitz and the Gulag. Many scholars have already accomplished this exercise in anthropological pessimism, illustrating the deep roots of evil in human beings. My approach will be different. I don't think that we are better or worse than our ancestors. Good and evil are equally distributed throughout the ages and the world. Even if the 20th century was certainly more violent at least in absolute terms, than the previous ones. Since antiquity, history has been depicted as a magistra vitae, but the lessons we drew from the past have not equipped us to avoid faults, wrongdoings, and tragic mistakes. This simple acknowledgement should induce scholars to modesty. They can historicize violence, not impede it. In this lecture, I will try to detect and describe some significant features of the violence of the last century, starting from its matrix. It is the cataclysms of Europe between 1914 and 1945, with some references to its developments in the following decades. I apologize, but a genealogical approach to the 20th century as the age of global violence implies adopting, to a certain extent, a Eurocentric view. Europe ceased to be the world's core in 1918, when the axis of international relations shifted from one side of the Atlantic to the other, from the old continent to the United States. But the Great War was the birthplace of the cataclysms of the 20th century. Of course, speaking of a matrix doesn't mean interpreting the European wars in purely endogenous terms, insofar as they were the result of a global process made of international experiences and external influences. I will just give a few examples. It is quite current among military historians, military scholars, to consider the American Civil War as the first total war of modern times. All historians of totalitarian violence point out one of its premises in the invention of the concentration camps that took place at the turn of the 20th century in Cuba and in South Africa, as we learned from the works of Professor Hislop. Post-colonial studies pertinently depict colonialism as a laboratory of fascism and National Socialism. Scholars are accustomed to thinking of Latin America as the locus of the first global genocide. There appeared the original forms of conquest and extermination that prefigured both modern racism and colonial destruction. The ideology of the conquerors, Spanish casticismo, and the idea of blood purity, limpieza de sangre, foreshadowed the Aryan myth of Nazi racial biology in the same way as the microbial genocide brought by Hernán Cortés anticipated the Victorian Holocausts of British imperialism in India and the Belgian devastation of Congo in the 19th century. All these historical experiences forged the matrix, but the Pandora's box of 20th century violence was opened in Europe. Between 1914 and 1945, Europe experienced a second 30 Years' War. This age of violence mirrored a global European crisis, a political crisis shaped by the collapse of the old liberal order and the eruption of the masses into the public sphere, and lasting until the advent of fascism and communism. An economic crisis shaped by the end of laissez-faire and the introduction in all countries of different forms of state intervention in the economy. And finally, a cultural crisis which put into question the previously dominant idea of progress. During this time, new paradigms of science merged with conservative worldviews inherited from the tradition of counter-enlightenment, creating hybrid and unknown forms of reactionary modernism. Since 1914, modernity revealed its most destructive and frightening face, that of total war. A still largely rural continent discovered the laws of a mechanized world, a temporality completely disconnected from the rhythm of nature, and a submission of bodies to the overwhelming impersonal Moloch of mass armies. Suddenly, the concept of modernity was no longer identified with material progress. It was rather related to an industrial war carried on by gigantic armies organized as industrial factories that incorporated soldiers transformed into workers of destruction. Such a definition simultaneously appeared in 1915 in the writings of Henri Barbusse and Arnold Zweig, Ouvrier de la Destruction, Arbeiter der Zerstörung. Total war became a rationalized and technologized massacre whose result was a death no longer glorified but serialized, a death without qualities, a mass anonymous death. This was, in the terms of Walter Benjamin, a mechanically reproducible death whose aura was forever stripped away in the mud of the trenches. Inaugurated with the myth of heroic death, inaugurated with the myth of heroic death, the Great War finished with commemorations of the unknown soldier. During this second 30 Years' War, Europe experienced an extraordinary fusion of conflicts: classical interstate wars, revolutions and counter-revolutions, civil wars, national liberation wars, genocide, violent confrontations between class, national, political, ideological forces, and also religious cleavages. The concept of European civil war synthesizes all these conflicts. The term's originator seems to have been the German painter Franz Marc, in a letter he wrote from the front shortly before his death at Verdun. He noted that, against the claims of propaganda, the World War was, I quote, a European civil war, a war against the inner invisible enemy of the European spirit. In the 1930s and the 1940s, the idea of European civil war appears in the writings of authors as different as Churchill, Keynes, Trotsky, de Gaulle, and Benedetto Croce. In spite of their discrepancies, all of them considered the decades between the two world wars as a moment in which, leaving its own self-destruction, Europe became aware of its common destiny. In the 1930s, the European Civil War tended to become an international civil war, with the constitution of the axis between Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan on the one hand, and the rise of anti-fascist culture in the Americas on the other hand. This tendency deeply shaped both literature and the arts, as eloquently shows an evocative mural of Diego Rivera, which today is conserved at the Museum of Fine Arts of Mexico City. It was painted in 1934, and it is titled El hombre controlador del universo, usually translated into English as Man at the Crossroads. Both titles are extremely pertinent, but it could also be called the Age of International Civil War. This composition is dominated by a central gigantic air screw, which symbolizes the 20th century as the era of technology, it would have been a world of machines, and human beings had to choose, speaking once again with Benjamin, between transforming it into a key to happiness or into a fetish of decadence. Ready for a final battle, two opposed social and political forces embody this dilemma. On the one hand, the proletarian on the one hand, the fascist armies with guns, bayonets, flamethrowers, and chemical arms. On the other hand, the proletarian armies of revolution with their red flags. On the bottom, nature is threatened. Science and culture are involved into this titanic conflict between progress and fascism. It seems to me that, perhaps because of its sumptuous ingenuity, this mural perfectly depicts the mental landscape of the first half of the 20th century, the framework in which its violence was inscribed. Of course, European civil war as well as international civil war are aporetic, contradictory concepts. Civil war means the breakup of internal order of a state, and neither Europe nor the international community were a state, a federation, or a civitas maxima, according to Hans Kelsen's reformulation of Kantian cosmopolitan right. The conflicts it experienced in those years, nonetheless, took the features of a civil war. According to all modern theories of law, war has its rules concerning both who can decide it, jus ad bellum, and the way it is conducted, jus in bello. On the one hand, only a sovereign state can declare a war. On the other hand, war needs a set of rules shared by all belligerents. They must respect the rights of prisoners, above all their right to life, and not to strike civilians, avoiding of their transformation into military targets. The law of war was only an aspect of the jus publicum europaeum. It is the advent of a codified system of relations between states owning the monopoly of legitimate violence on their territories. This conception is implicit in the famous sentence opening Clausewitz's Treaty on War from the first half of the 19th century. War is only dueling, Zweikampf, on a large scale. In fact, the social practice of dueling, hugely widespread among aristocratic layers up until 1914, reveals a growing adaptation to law and to certain shared norms in the use of violence. In the summer 1914, these norms seemed still self-evident when the Sarajevo assassination detonated a conflict that burned the continent. Of course, the Great War had its causes, about which historical debates still rumble. Scholars prefer to speak of premises or conditions rather than of causes in a deterministic way, but it was not foreseen by its actors. According to Christopher Clark, those responsible for such a conflict, I quote, were sleepwalkers, watchful but unseeing, haunted by dreams, yet blind to the reality of the horror they were about to bring into the world. End of quote. Nobody among those responsible for the conflict had foreseen armies of millions of men enclosed for years in their trenches. Nobody had thought of chemical arms, bombings, destroyed towns, and serial killings by machine gun fire. Their mental habitus and cultural references belonged to the European experience of the 19th century, with their civilized wars between old regime states mutually respecting each other. The friendship between the French captain Beaulieu, Pierre Freinet, and the German officer von Haufenstein, Erich von Stroheim, romantically depicted by Jean Renoir in La Grande Illusion, 1937, is the mirror of such a dynastic and aristocratic conception of war that would not survive the First World War. During the Great War, on the contrary, the confrontation between legitimate enemies was quickly replaced by their crusade to destroy each other. At Christmas 1914, combat was suspended for a day. Several photos show German officers and soldiers fraternizing with their British and French homologues in the no man's land between the enemy lines. This ephemeral brotherhood indicates that they viewed each other as legitimate enemies. In the following years, however, such events were not to be repeated. Jus in bello was rapidly buried. At Ypres, on April 1915, during the first gas attack by the German troops, the law of war was the reminiscence of a finished epoch. Suddenly, the technology of the 20th century troubled the system of values of a dynastic continent. The eruption of modernity merging with old traditions and representations of war is emblematically illustrated by the image of a medieval warrior combating in a chemical warfare, a hybrid figure of non-contemporaneity, of the coexistence of different historical temporalities. I will come back to this point. Of course, Jus Publicum Europaeum had its ambiguities and hidden ideological purposes. Since its implicit corollary was the vision of non-Western world as a wasteland open to colonization, a vacuum locis where occupation didn't need consent, wars of conquest and massacres were ipso facto perceived as just war in the name of natural law, according to a principle fixed by John Locke in the 17th century. Conceived as invasions and often also as extermination campaigns in which European troops were not confronted with all their regular armies but with tribes and combatants without a well-defined status, colonial wars didn't distinguish between soldiers and civilians. From this perspective, the violence of colonialism constituted a model for the total wars of the 20th century. Of course, colonial wars were not civil wars because they opposed forces politically and culturally extremely distant from one another. They were not conflicts opposing members of the same community, and their violence didn't stem from a crisis inside a state no longer able to hold the monopoly of force. Nevertheless, some features were similar. The figure of legitimate enemy, justus hostis, is foreign to both civil war and colonial war, where enemies are outlaws to be defeated and destroyed, and with whom any compromise is impossible. A civil war without atrocities and horrors doesn't exist. One of its features is the deep emotional involvement of its actors. The feeling of accomplishing a duty could inspire the volunteers of 1914, but it is not enough for justifying the participation in a civil war. In other words, a civil war is always a mixture of juridical anomie and emotional plenitude, both pushed to the extreme, as if the vacuum created by the fall of norms was to be filled with a new existential content. Combat is not regulated by law, but by superior ethical and political convictions that one must completely defend in the most intransigent way, at any cost, eliminating the enemy, a close, known enemy, and also, if necessary, sacrificing one's own life. The values filling this space of anomie can be the most estimable or the most abject, and are sometimes a mixture of both: liberation, justice, equality, human dignity, freedom from oppression, but also vengeance, racism, exacerbated nationalism, ideological and religious fanaticism. Civil war doesn't search for a just peace, but rather the destruction of the enemy. At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, Churchill and Roosevelt declared in a common statement that their allied forces would not accept any compromise with Germany and Japan, but only their unconditional surrender. It is interesting to observe that in such a declaration that already announced the tribunals of Nuremberg and Tokyo, the American president and the British prime minister didn't use the conventional word of the military lexicon, capitulation. They chose to speak of unconditional surrender, adopting the statement that the Unionists had imposed on the Confederates at the end of the American Civil War. Such a formulation, unconditional surrender, did not belong to international law. It was borrowed from commercial law, where it indicated a transfer of property. In a capitulation, soldiers lay down their arms during a public ceremony, symbolizing their defeat, but they still belong to the army of a state whose legal existence is recognized by international law, including by the victors. On the other hand, in an unconditional surrender, the defeated army becomes a kind of property of the victor that imposes its domination. General Wilhelm Keitel, who signed the unconditional surrender of Germany at Berlin-Karlhorst on May 9, 1945, was judged at Nuremberg the following year and executed as a criminal, as a war criminal. The same happened to General Hideki Toyo, who, captured and judged by the International Military Tribunal for Far East, was sentenced of death and executed in 1948. At the end of the war, as Hans Kelsen has observed in many articles, the Allies occupying Japan and Germany decided to deprive them of any form of national sovereignty, originally thought for several decades. At Casablanca, Roosevelt and Churchill decided to refuse any negotiations with Germany and Japan, and to exclude any international juridical norm that could have obstructed territorial transfers and boundary changes in enemy countries. Unconditional surrender allowed a redefinition of the European and Asian maps. In the second half of the 20th century, many wars, from the Vietnam War to the last Iraq War, reproduced similar features, both in their military practices and also in their conclusions. A change of political regime imposed by the victors on the defeated enemies. Thus, in spite of their operatic character, the concepts of civil war, of European civil war and international civil war, seem particularly pertinent to describe at least the two major features of contemporary war, from the collapse of the European order in 1914 to the conflicts engendered by the end of the Cold War. First, since 1914, interstate wars are fought like civil wars, with massive violation of the law of war, not declared blitzkrieg, starvation of the prisoners of war, etc. In short, jus in bello is abandoned. It almost appears as a vestige of the 19th century. Second, the wars of this age become wars against civilians. This phenomenon was still limited during the Great War, but it became much more evident during the Second World War, in which they constitute more than a half of the victims. Furthermore, both the First and the Second World Wars have been the matrix of genocides. The genocide of the Armenians in the declining Ottoman Empire in 1915-16, the genocide of the Jews and the Gypsies by the Nazis during the Second World War. Both wars produced mass bombings of cities, economic blockade, planned starvation, forced transfers of population, mass refugees, and millions of displaced people. In the most recent decades, this tendency was openly incorporated into military visions and strategies beyond any hypocritical occultation, through the fabrication of very sophisticated technological weapons that kill civilians but preserve the life of soldiers. The logic of the jus publicum Europaeum was the conception of war as a regulated conflict between legitimate enemies sharing common rules. The logic of contemporary air bombings and drone warfare is that of asymmetrical conflicts in which casualties only concern one of the belligerents. The 20th century is the age of wars and genocides. The latter were conceived and perpetrated within a context of war, disruption of political order and state boundaries. This symbiotic link between war and genocide is fundamental, but we need to separate them, at least conceptually. The proclivity to classify many different historical experiences of violence as genocide is the scholarly frame of our time, dominated by the discourse on human rights, in which the past is depicted as an indistinct age of violence, in front of which rests our time of post-totalitarian wisdom and peaceful liberal democracy. For instance, one of the most important books of the last years on the Spanish Civil War is titled The Spanish Holocaust by the great historian Paul Preston. Of course, this tendency is deeply related to our global regime of historicity, as sensitive to human rights as depoliticized. I'm quite skeptical towards the shift of the concept of genocide from its original field, which is criminal law, to the humanities. Transforming a juridical category into an analytical tool for historical interpretation is a dangerous procedure that reduces the complexity of historical experience with its multiple causalities, actors, and temporal dimensions into a binary confrontation between perpetrators and victims, and thus impoverishes our historical understanding. I think that this metamorphosis of genocide into a global hermeneutical prism shows the submission of scholarship to the compelling rule of memory, which is much more interested in public recognition of victims than in explaining the historical process that produced them. Caught in the web of a respectable struggle for justice, historians offered scholarly support to memorial claims, sometimes forgetting their task of elaborating a critical discourse on the past. To a certain extent, this is not astonishing, nor is it new. Historians don't live into an ivory tower and cannot escape the intellectual, political, and even psychological constraints coming from the societies in which they live, occasionally from their own lived experience, but they should introduce a critical distance in the relationship that any given society establishes with its own past. In my view, not abusing the concept of genocide, not applying it to any form of violence, doesn't mean establishing a morally indecent hierarchy between victims, but rather preserving historical lucidity and insightfulness. In other words, I don't suggest eliminating the word genocide from our lexicon, but I think it needs to be inscribed into a more nuanced and multi-causal methodological approach. The 20th century was the golden age of another figure of war, and particularly of civil war, the partisan. The partisan is an irregular combatant appearing in all the theaters of war, sometimes playing a decisive role. During the Second World War, there were several millions in Europe waging a parallel war beside the regular armies, mobilizing millions of soldiers. From 1943 onwards, the resistance took a mass dimension as an armed movement both in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and in Western societies, from Holland to Belgium, from France to Italy. In China and Vietnam, the Communist Partisans' Army grew enormously under the Japanese occupation until taking power between 1945 and 1949. During the war, fascist and Nazi propaganda justified its repression, violence, deportation, and massacre of civilians with the pretext of the anti-partisan struggle. Posters threatening death to all kinds of resistance combatants, called bandits and terrorists, covered the countries occupied by German troops. The emergence of the figure of partisan during the Second World War reveals the anomic character of this conflict, its transgression of traditional rules of war, and therefore its civil war nature. Carl Schmitt has sketched the portrait of the partisan as an ideal type. Above all, he is an irregular combatant who distinguishes himself from the soldier wearing a uniform. The deep motivation of his struggle lies in his intensive political involvement, as indicated by the etymology of his name, which refers to membership in a party. His activity combines mobility, rapidity, and unexpected alternation of offensive and retreat, especially when it is coordinated with that of a regular army. Finally, the partisan has a telluric character. In most cases, he is deeply rooted in a territory he wishes to liberate, and his action takes advantage from his organic links with local population in the mountains as well as in the cities. Therefore, the partisan is a central figure in a war claiming a justa causa, but not recognizing a justus hostis. The Second World War exalted both the liberations guerrillero and the political combatant. Their features fused into the partisan, sometimes conferring on him an almost mythical aura. In the countries where a liberation army created by partisans took power against the occupation forces, its charismatic leader became quite naturally the chief of a new state, as with Marshal Tito in Yugoslavia. After the Second World War, the partisan became the hero of innumerable wars and revolutions, from Asia to Africa and Latin America. Today, he reappears under the new hideous form of Islamic terrorism, with their mixture of sunny radical nationalism, religious fundamentalism, ideological obscurantism, and fascination with extreme violence. Its combatants are a monstrous caricature of the 20th century partisans, guerrilleros, and revolutionaries. Today, however, the telluric partisan is become a relatively archaic figure, which was eclipsed by the global extraterritorial terrorist, the jihadist, who can perpetrate his attacks in New York, Paris, or Baghdad. In the age of total war, in which wars become anomic conflicts without shared rules, violence spreads and takes the form of crime and transgression. Hate loses its abstract characters. It is a mental disposition and a feeling that nourishes political choices and becomes an active drive. The suspension of law and the breakdown of the state's monopoly of force create the context allowing for the spontaneous outbreak of violence. From this point of view, it is incontestable that modern wars imply a regression of the civilizing process. Social and cultural constraints that mold our mental frames and psychic economy explode. In a civil war, violence is never only instrumental. It takes on a strong symbolic dimension and grows following a dynamic that transforms it into its own goal. In other words, extreme violence converts into cruelty. Civil war exhumes and increases old feelings and impulses that are articulated alongside contemporary hopes and frustrations. The enemy must not only be killed, he must be publicly humiliated and exhibited as a war trophy. Therefore, fascists and Nazis hang executed partisans in Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Italy, and the Balkans. This violence inevitably stimulated a counter-violence that sometimes reproduced the same features, even if now it was perpetrated in the name of justice, freedom, and democracy. Hence, the corpse of Mussolini was lynched by the mob in Piazzale Loreto in Milano on April 29, 1945. This is the picture. As historian Sergio Luzzatto pertinently remarks, civil war is also a bodily tragedy. It always brings a part of excessive, spectacular, horrible violence as a kind of anthropological extreme limit. The 20th century, I said, experienced a mixture of total wars, civil wars, and genocide. It created a context in which a savage and ancestral violence merged with the modern violence of total war. During this troubled age, one might say, borrowing the words of Alain Corbin, the Dionysian impulsions of avenger crowds coexisted with the pasteurized massacres of state violence. In other words, the violence born from the regression of the civilizing process joined in an astonishing dialectic of non-contemporaneity with the modern, much more murderous violence of industrial and technological society. Such violence implied the results of the civilizing process: the state monopoly of arms, managerial and productive rationality, the fragmentation of tasks and the division of labor, control over impulsions, social neutralization of ethical norms, spatial separation between victims and executors. Both the image of burned villages and the crematoriums of Auschwitz belong to the memory of the Second World War. Observed through the lens of anthropology, 20th century violence, from the Russian Civil War to the Holocaust, from Hiroshima to the Cambodian killing fields, reveals this mixture of archaism and modernity. While the engineers of Frankfurt top factories invented spatial crematoria able to withstand prolonged use and very high temperatures, the Einsatzgruppen carried on their Partisanenkampf on the Eastern Front, where the captured combatants were hanged in the central squares of villages. The Nazi Partisanenkampf perpetuated a tradition of manhunt, which, invented in the Middle Age and adopted by the aristocracy under absolutism, was anything but modern. The Red Army, on the other hand, practiced rape on a mass scale. With its colonial imagination, American State Secretary George Kennan described the advance of the Red Army in eastern Prussia in 1944 as the pillage of an Asiatic horde. Similar non-simultaneity or non-synchronism of violent practices belonging to different ages also distinguished the war in the Pacific. While the scholars gathered in Los Alamos created the first atomic bomb, in the Asian jungle, the Marines decorated their vehicles with the skulls of killed Japanese soldiers, exhuming customs of the Indian wars of the 19th century. The Japanese army pushed the coexistence of technological rationality and the code of honor inherited from the samurai ethics to paroxysm, forming its officers and soldiers to both the use of chemical weapons and the practice of ritual suicide, seppuku, in the name of the emperor. These different forms of violence, hot and cold, archaic and modern, coexisted in the same war. Civilization and barbarism are not two absolutely antagonistic terms, but two linked aspects of the same historical process, carrying both emancipatory and destructive tendencies. In spite of Norbert Elias' naive thoughts on the civilizing process, these tendencies belong to all modern wars. During the last Iraq war, the most sophisticated arms coexisted with the most primitive forms of torture and humiliation in the military prison of Abu Ghraib. In the perspective of world history, the Second World War appears as a traumatic condensation of many transformations that prefigured the modern concept of globalization. All the elements of such a process, growing economic interdependence, mass population displacements, exile and diaspora, technological and scientific transfers, cultural hybridity between nations and continents, developed and accelerated through the prism of war. When thousands of persecuted European scholars emigrated to the United States, many historians define this phenomenon as a cultural and scientific exodus from one coast of the Atlantic Ocean to another, and when millions of American, Asian, African, and Australian soldiers fought in Europe, a new perception of the planet, a new imagination, and a new mental landscape suddenly emerged and came into sight. The Second World War was also a powerful accelerator for research as well as applied science. During this conflict, the distinction between science and engineering, between science as knowledge and technology as the mastering of nature, objects, and human beings became an increasingly porous border. The war experienced the birth of a new technocratic elite encompassing political and military responsible engineers, industrial managers, systems inventors, computers, lasers, radars, aeronautics, and missiles, as well as a great number of scholars, physicians, mathematicians, biologists, economists, geographers, etc., from both European and American universities. War offered them almost inexhaustible opportunities to invent and create without any economic constraints, engendering the durable illusion of the unlimited power of science. In other words, the war experienced the secularization of science, a descent of science from its ebony tower into a profane world in which it became intrinsically technical and practical. A secularization of science that found its emblematic illustration in the fabrication and use of the atomic bomb. Aerial warfare clearly illustrates this technological change. The First World War experienced some primitive forms of aerial warfare, mostly taking place in border city and whose casualties were extremely limited in number. However, during the Second World War, aerial bombing turned into the systematic and planned destruction of the civil societies of the enemy's countries. Coventry, Dresden, Hamburg, Tokyo, and Hiroshima remain the symbols of this hubris of devastation. According to the philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, the Second World War engendered a new, eminently modern form of atmo-terrorism. The target of aerial bombing was not only the enemy army, but also its civil society, whose natural habitat, in the biological meaning of the word, had to be destroyed. The technological advances of aerial warfare in the post-war decades did not change this conception of war. They simply improved it, leading to the recent invention of drones that seem to realize the dream of a war without human casualties on the side of the aggressor. Eric Hobsbawm wrote that National Socialism did not prevail because of the persistence of the legacy of the Enlightenment in the 20th century. The forces of the Axis, whose desire to banish a universal idea of humanity was clearly proclaimed, had been defeated by a coalition of liberalism and communism, the inheritors of the Enlightenment in the 20th century. Nonetheless, this conflict was not reducible to a titanic clash between Enlightenment and anti-Enlightenment. It also revealed the antinomies of modernity, the age of instrumental rationalism, in which technical progress became a tool of domination and blind destruction. It unveils, we could say, quoting Adorno and Horkheimer, the dialectic of Enlightenment. The First World War had revealed modernity as the denaturalization of violence, a violence confiscated and monopolized by anonymous mechanical apparatuses. The Second World War pushed many currents of critical thought to recognize a link between technical modernity and the dehumanization of the world. Suddenly, the famous iron cage described by Max Weber as the destiny of Western rationalism seemed to take a concrete, awful form. In August 1945, Albert Camus wrote that science had turned into organized murder. The world had to choose between collective suicide and an intelligent use of scientific conquests. This alternative still remains a major interrogation at the beginning of the 21st century. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you to Professor Traverso for a wonderful lecture. We can take a few questions. Anybody like to kick off? Matthew.
Thank you for this sweeping talk, which includes what I found to be a tremendously suggestive approach to the employment of the international and the civil as concepts to describe forms of war that in some ways counterintuitive and also include provocative suggestions about the use of the term genocide and so on. I've got questions about that as well, but I wanted to ask a kind of meta question that maybe speaks a little bit more to method and to the relationship between the use of art or of artists' comments for historical cognition. And I ask this because especially in the first half of the talk, you made a lot of interesting references to, or mentioned Clark's reference to sleepwalkers, or used the Diego Rivera painting, or Franz Marc's lines about the European Civil War, and then there's a Renoir image, etc. And so I'm just wondering if I thought this was very useful as a listener to such talk. I was just wondering, does art have an illustrative function or also an epistemological function with regard to your own construction of historical cognition?
Yeah. Well, thank you for this question. And, it's difficult to answer this question because I think that the arts in general, both so literature, paintings, movies. So Western culture was, of course, traumatized by the First World War, and of course, its creations during the years between the two world wars mirrored this brutalization of European cultures. Some scholars depict this process as a kind of anthropological change. For instance, George Mosse. And I think that the arts are a good field in order to explore the transformations that shaped the European culture and also mental universe, the mental habitus. But I think that the arts were to a large extent paralyzed by this trauma and by this eruption of violence. There are many interesting books which point out that paintings, the European painters were unable to restitute the horrible experiences many of them had experienced on the trenches. So there was a kind of gap between a lived experience and the capacity of art, of aesthetic creation to elaborate this experience. From this point of view, so I think that we could establish an interesting parallel with the literature of the concentration camps and extermination camps. It is a commonplace of many witnesses of Auschwitz that Auschwitz was hell, but they were unable to describe it. Of course, words existed in order to depict very in detail, very precisely what happened and what they had lived. But for somebody who never was in a trench or in a concentration camp or in Auschwitz, these words are unable to transmit this lived experience. And so I think that on the one hand, aesthetic creation, aesthetic production was completely shaped and transformed by this eruption of violence. On the other hand, it remained unable to elaborate this experience. So it is only a testimony of so in my book, I give many examples. It is a testimony of the way in which, after the First World War, death became a violent death. We can see this very clearly in many pictorial productions after. So the First World War, the tendency is to depict death as no longer a natural death, the natural conclusion of a cycle of life, but death becomes violent death. And it's also the time in which a philosopher like Martin Heidegger elaborates his idea of Sein zum Tod. So the Eigentlichkeit, the authenticity of existence is to be aware of this permanent possibility of dying. So.
A kind of anthropological question, I guess, and also in answer to this sweeping Matthew's talk, which I think beautifully encompasses contradictory dynamics of this century. What do you say to the extraordinary clinical sadism of the scientific atrocity of so many pieces of this century's wars, of gas invented specifically to torment, not just to kill, of things like napalm invented, later in World War II and continued in Vietnam and other places that are, designed to injure profoundly perhaps on the way to killing, or human experimentation in some of the concentration camps. Experiments designed not necessarily to discover anything medically useful, but with a kind of extraordinary clinical precision of sadistic harm. I don't know how else to say that. I guess I want to push the coming together of mass clinical scale scientific violence and that partisanal, what you call archaic violence. But how do you explain the astonishing sadism at its core?
Well, I'm not sure to be able to explain that. Anyhow, so this is a major contradiction of the 20th century, and it is an open and permanent interrogation for scholars. So I have to say that investigating the history of violence and wars, I was growingly convinced by Herbert Marcuse's conception of science and modern technology. And so I think that so the critical theory couldn't be understood exclusively through intellectual, as the result of an intellectual process. So it was also an answer to the experiences of the 20th century. And so Marcuse basically said that we shouldn't think to modern technology as a neutral realm. So we have technologies and we can use them fruitfully, or we can use them in a bad way for making wars, and etc., etc. And he stressed that in the 20th century, technology is intrinsically rooted in a project of domination and is intrinsically connected to war and violence. And and it is a fact that wars have been fundamental steps in the advance of scientific research, and so with these particular features. I said secularization of science, a science that becomes immediately operational. Operational, yeah. So at the same time, these astonishing developed science put on the service of violence and war is combined with the reappearance, with the exhumation, so with the coming back of very archaic, ancestral, very old forms of violence. And from this point of view, I think that the wars of the 20th century reveal also the fragility of our concept of civilization. So, at the edge of the First World War, most European statesmen, thinkers, intellectuals, thought that the time of torture was over, because all over the 19th century, torture impressively regressed, dropped in Europe, so not outside of Europe, but in Europe. So when we speak of in Western world, Jus publicum Europaeum. And so after 1914, we experienced not only the coming back of old forms of violence, but also the coming back in a much more sophisticated way. So it is I'm surprised when we read Norbert Elias. He published in 1939 his book, which is a classic of contemporary sociology, über den Prozess der Zivilisation, so the civilizing process and so he explains that so we have civilized wars and barbarian wars, and so so he published this book in 1939, the year of the breakup of the Second World War. So this combination, I think that this concept of coexistence between different historical temporalities in a same, so synchronized in a same historical context. So Ernst Bloch conceptualized this idea, this experience through this idea of Ungleichzeitigkeit, of non-contemporaneity, non-synchronicity. And I think that the 20th century was the age of this coexistence between different historical temporalities. So perhaps this is a feature of all historical times, but so we became aware of that through the wars and violence of the 20th century.
To the first question, and also your comment on technology being inherently tied to war and violence, would you say that the art of today is perhaps an advancement on, for example, Picasso's Guernica, which took much expertise and many years? Now we have the internet, and everyone can be an artist that communicates their experience or reflects on
Well, I think that with globalization, scholars are more and more exposed to these kind of interrogations on the how to say that, on the ethical premises of their work we have to be aware that the discrepancy between the Western world on the one hand and what we today call the South. So this gap is enormous. September 11 was a historical turn, which changed the international relations, created the premises of multiple wars. So we could think to the trauma produced by the attacks, terrorist attacks in Paris last year. So, but in other parts of the world, this is everyday life. So this is something, and we are accustomed, more and more accustomed. I realized that many years ago. So in 1994, I participated in many conferences on the Holocaust, and after having discussed during the afternoon the history of the Holocaust, we come back to the hotel, switched the TV, and heard about a genocide in Rwanda. I think that this reality should inevitably puts many questions and interrogates our way of working, I recognize that I and my colleagues, I think most of them share my impression or my attitude. We are uncomfortable. So because the reaction, there is a possible solution which is very, very comfortable and hypocritical. So that would be to say, I ignore what happens today. I'm a historian, I'm a scholar, I have my field, and I work on archives, I work in my libraries, and I try to produce scientific knowledge separated from the conflicts and the violence of the surrounding world. I think that it's impossible, and it's perhaps also indecent to do that. But at the same time, we cannot produce knowledge on violence or investigate violence with a personal direct commitment in that. Because investigation implies a distance, a critical distance. And we have, it would be much more, perhaps a colleague working on medieval history could contest, but I think that working on contemporary history and the 20th century permanently rises this kind of questions which are at the same time scholarly and ethical questions, intellectual and ethical questions. And so we have to work through, speaking in psychoanalytical terms, we have to do that.
Can I ask one last question? And then I'm going to close. One of the things I found very interesting in the book is your discussion of the anti-fascist politics of the 1930s and 40s. And I think I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you steer, I think, an interesting course between sort of uncritical celebration of it, which you sometimes find, and on the other hand, the sort of condemnation of it as simply a sort of byproduct of kind of totalitarian politics. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about, what you think that politics of anti-fascism at that time says to us, or how you think about it historically.
So I think that one of the reasons that pushed me to write this book was at the end of the 90s, so at the turn of 2000, a huge, speaking with Jürgen Habermas, a huge anti-fascist campaign that took place in Western Europe. In Italy today, so fascism has been practically rehabilitated. So it's a commonplace in Italy to say that fascism wasn't so bad, so except its complicity in the Holocaust, otherwise fascism was good. And in Spain, the reinterpretation of the Spanish Civil War, the emergence of this very popular revisionist historian really, Pio Moa, explaining that the Spanish Civil War wasn't the product of an army's putsch, but rather was produced by a Bolshevik threat on the Second Republic and so on. And so in Germany, the reunification that was conceived as an anti-fascist reunification. So the syllogism was widespread that fascism means communism, communism means totalitarianism, and by concept, so consequently, anti-fascism means totalitarianism. And I think that this is a completely deforming and wrong prism. I thought, writing this book, that we had to re-establish the role played by different actors at that time, and we had to recognize that so the post-war democracies were built by this anti-fascist struggle. But at the same time, I think that we cannot today oppose a very simplistic vision of anti-fascism as totalitarianism. We can oppose to this vision a simple defense of anti-fascism. We have to historicize critically anti-fascism. Anti-fascism is a process with multiple dimensions, with internal contradictions, with different... So it's not a block, a monolithic block. It's an heterogeneous, complex experience. And of course, anti-fascism was also shaped by Stalinism. Anti-fascism was the inheritor of a European culture so deeply shaped by anti-Semitism, and anti-fascism was unable to see the nature, the true nature of Nazi anti-Semitism, and so on. So a critical historization is attempted to historicize anti-fascism, of course, shouldn't hide these dimensions, should rather try to analyze and explain that. But I think that we have to reject these binary, these dichotomical vision of totalitarianism and liberal democracy. So the history was much more complex than that.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.